Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. Welcome to our Penn State football spring practice coverage. Practice number 1 in the books for the Nittany Lions on a Tuesday morning. We will be on the field for practice number 2 on Thursday. Excited to get a long look at a very different team than the last one we encountered on the field in December. We are fresh out of a press conference in Beaver Stadium with head coach Matt Campbell, who had just conducted his first ever Nittany Lions practice. He is Daniel Gallen. I am Tyler Donahue. A little bit later, you will hear from our colleague and recruiting insider, Tyler Calvaruso. He'll break down 2 new crystal ball commitment predictions for Penn State to add to their next recruiting class, both of them of the 4-star variety. He'll join us a little bit later. We'll also get into some recruiting ramifications of spring ball opening up, as we're going to see a lot of prospects and targets coming to campus in the coming weeks starting today. So stick around for that. But first things first, as I said, we just spent time in Beaver Stadium with Matt Campbell, our first time chatting with him in a Q&A session since early February. So naturally, a lot to catch up on. And Daniel, we're going to get into it to start on some injury-related updates, because we're always talking about player availability, who's going to accomplish what on the field this spring. And some of those names have been familiar to you here on the podcast, and we're going to kind of assess where things stand, starting with the new QB1 in town, a 3-year starter for Iowa State. Quarterback Rocco Becht underwent shoulder surgery during the offseason. We spoke with him in February. He kind of gave us a bit of a timeline. He had hoped to be involved to some capacity on the practice field, although we figured not to a full extent. And that's essentially what we got from Matt Campbell on Tuesday, who said that Rocco Becht was indeed on the field, yet we're not going to see him playing a lot of live ball over the course of this month.
Yeah, Matt Campbell said that Rocco Becht isn't going to take live reps, but was out there today throwing. Is going to be doing some 7-on-7 stuff. I think 3/2, so it's like half of 7-on-7, and then just be participating in individual and conditioning and all the other stuff that they go through. That lines up with what Becht told us last month. He said that he was a couple of days away from starting to throw that weekend, and that was 3 weeks ago. So he's got that under his belt. I think the one thing that Becht said that I put at the bottom of our story on Lions247 is that being on the field is really important for him in terms of showing his new teammates what he's about. We know that there's a lot of Iowa State guys who already know him, but there's also a lot of Penn State guys and guys from elsewhere who, this isn't their quarterback from the past couple of years. So Becht viewed it as really important for him to be out there in some capacity, being able to be a leader and showing his new teammates what he's all about. So he's going to get to do that in at least some sort of capacity.
Yeah, Campbell already said his leadership presence on the field is important for this team right now. He's one of 24 Iowa State transfers who'd followed this coaching staff. And of course, when you're talking about the quarterback position, guy who's played this extensively, more than 9,000 career passing yards. He's been through the fire with this coaching staff, with this offensive coordinator, with this quarterbacks coach and head coach. But let's talk about the ramifications, because this essentially confirms what we anticipated, that there's going to be a lot of snaps going to other quarterbacks in first team settings, 11-on-11 football going up against this defense. You never see a quarterback really get knocked to the ground. And if you do, that defender is probably running laps for the rest of practice. But what quarterbacks are going to see some fairly live bullets during the course of this 4-week process and into April? Alex Mansky is the first name that we probably go to here. He was Rocco Becht's primary backup last year as a true freshman. He was able to win that job despite missing spring camp because he was recovering from an elbow injury that he suffered as a high school senior. 6'3", 225-pound range. We've talked about it before. The staff is very high on what he could mean long-term to the Nittany Lions, but they also want to make sure they have a really strong fallback plan in case Becht is not able to go at some point this season. And so to me, a lot of that spotlight shifts to Mansky. And at the same time, we've got to tip our cap toward Connor Berry, who's going to spend his final year of college eligibility here in State College after spending a few seasons at the Division III level. He was an All-American at that level at Christopher Newport. But he has some background, as you pointed out in past podcasts, with Appalachian State. And then there's a couple true freshmen, Peyton Falzone, Case Evans. They'll get their work as well. But I think in terms of who you're going to see step up there behind the first-team offensive line, working with whoever's going to be out there with the first-team tight ends, running backs, receivers, Mansky and Berry are really at the forefront. And we'll get our first look at that situation Thursday.
I think the biggest ramifications are for Alex Mansky in terms of what he can be able to do and the experience that he can get this spring. Like you said, won that number 2 job behind Rocco Becht last year, knows what Taylor Mauser and Jake Waters want out of this offense. And on top of that, he's I think a pretty physically intriguing quarterback. He finished the recruiting cycle as a composite 4-star. He's listed at 6'4", 217 on the roster right now. That puts him as one of the bigger quarterbacks in that room. I know that Peyton Falzone is always going to be the biggest in most quarterback rooms that he's in, but I think Mansky has some really interesting tools, and I think that he's someone where getting to see him getting exposure is not only big for this fall as the number 2 quarterback, but as you cast an eye towards the future and what that might look like in terms of what this staff is going to have to do on the quarterback front in terms of recruiting and the transfer portal. But in terms of right now, I mean, I think that's big for Mansky, to get on the same page as these new wide receivers, stake his claim for that number 2 job. And with Connor Berry, like I said, he has experience at Appalachian State, coming out of Northern Virginia originally. So he's seen FBS football. He's seen D1 football. But still, you got to get back up to speed after a couple of years at the D3 level. It's a different game, different types of athletes. And I think the understanding is that the aptitude is there for Connor Berry. I think Tyler Calvaruso talked a little bit about how this could be good for a potential coaching career for him down the road. But they might need him to play physically right away. And so I think this spring could be good for him. Get his feet under him, get used to the speed at this level, speed of this roster before you move forward.
So I referred to Mansky as 6'3", 225. You referred to him as 6'4", 217. We were both a little off. I heard 6. Did you? I heard 6'4". And if I'm wrong, then our audience can correct me later. But yeah, 6'3", 217. So about 8 pounds lighter than his listed weight for Iowa State last year. I can ditch the 225 that I keep referencing. When we look at the receiver spot, which is obviously in sync with QB over the course of these practices, you're going to be missing a couple guys from some of this work. And when it comes to live work specifically, Brett Eskelson and Chase Sowell, who were starters for Iowa State last year, both of them 30-plus catches, 500-plus receiving yards. Both of them really came on strong as the year went on with some big playability. Neither of them are expected to do live reps. Matt Campbell basically said they're in the same boat as Rocco Becht this spring. And so that opens the door for some other guys. We'll talk about them in a moment. But we will see Eskelson and Sowell involved in individual drills. We'll see them involved in probably some 7-on-7 work. So we hope to have some feedback on both of these guys for you. But I guess if you're going to be missing any 2 of these dudes at the receiver position, it's 2 guys that have played a lot of power conference football, because pretty much everyone else in this room, excluding Kobe Howard because of what he was able to gain for maybe the last 6 weeks of the season last year and into the bowl game as a starter, as a guy who flashed a bit, really everybody has a ton to prove in game action. And that means with those 2 off the field, again, you get into 11-on-11 live work against a very talented defensive secondary, an experienced group of cornerbacks. You're going to see some guys have to step up. And we heard from Matt Campbell about several of them. But first things first, what's your initial reaction to confirmation from what we heard really a month ago, talking to some players, specifically Becht, that these 2 guys might be limited, might not be able to be full go through April?
I think when you talk about 2 guys who are missing this spring, I think that these are 2 of the ones that you can worry the least about, given the amount of reps that they have banked with Rocco Becht over the past couple of years at Iowa State. At the same time, you want to have everyone on the field together in terms of chemistry, working that stuff out, getting on the same page from that perspective. But I think that in terms of a quarterback wide receiver relationship, I think that there's already something there. And then on top of that, like, they'll still be out there. They're in the same, like you said, in the same boat as Beck. So still be seeing them in individual work, those types of things. And, that still counts. Those are still reps. That's still getting out on the field. Obviously, no substitute for live bullets when it comes to football. But I think these are 2 guys that, kind of know what they're doing with this offense and with this quarterback. And then I think it opens the door for a lot of really intriguing guys that, we don't really know a lot about. Even Kobe Howard, we saw him, but at this point, I still don't know what he's about, as a player playing significant reps. And I think a lot of these guys too, sat at Iowa State last year or were elsewhere, or sitting at Penn State. And now I think the door might be open for them.
Yeah, we heard from Matt Campbell on a couple guys who were freshmen on the Iowa State roster last year. Karan Brookins, he said, is, quote, a super talent. He called Zay Robinson, quote, a really talented young guy. They liked what they got out of them on the practice field last year. Didn't really see that translate into extensive game action, but they're redshirt freshmen. That's the same deal for Lyric Samuel. Kobe Howard's a second-year player. He's a sophomore. And then Peter Gonzalez, who's a redshirt sophomore, been at the college level for a bit longer, but injuries really hampered what he was able to accomplish on the practice field and certainly in game action the last couple of years. So he's a relatively unknown commodity at the receiver spot. Keith Jones Jr. is a pretty captivating figure that they brought in from Grambling via the transfer portal. Outstanding athleticism, big 6'4" frame, has some production at the college level from last season. And then you have a couple freshmen that factor in: Amarian Jackson, Ben Whitver, both of them highly accomplished at the high school level on fields in Nebraska and down in Virginia. But this is a big jump forward going up against the Big Ten defense every day in practice. And of course, you've got a new leader in that position room, the second new leader of this offseason after you say goodbye to Noah Pauley, as Kashif Moore gets to work with this group. And so, Daniel, a lot there for the picking in terms of reps and guys who are going to get a chance to rise up. And I think coming out of Matt Campbell's press conference, I'll be paying more attention to Karan Brookins, because he's a guy that, although we didn't see it firsthand, it feels like if we were covering Iowa State last year and we were privy to a lot of the day-to-day coverage that you do as a beat reporter, we would have been talking about him more in recent months. So he's back on my radar in a further extent than it was, going into today. Anyone for you that you're particularly excited to see on Thursday when we get in the field, whether it's working against a cornerback for his quarterback or just going through positional drills?
With Brookings, it's something that I think we talked a little bit about off mic in terms of these big guys that Iowa State likes to bring in at the wide receiver position and, work them out, build them up. I know I've talked about it a little bit with Lyric Samuel, but I think Brookings is that guy, in terms of, 6'5", 207 right now. I think that your imagination can really start to go when you think about what can this guy do in 2-3 years, of college football. You mentioned Alex Mansky's new weight. Penn State updated its roster late last week, and I went through and compared it to what we had listed elsewhere. And Ben Whitver was one of the ones who popped out. He was listed at 190 when he signed. He's up to 204 now. He's listed at 6'2" in terms of his height. I think that's I think pretty sturdy wide receiver, I think, is how you would profile that. We know how accomplished he is. We know that he's going to have a leap up in competition when it comes to the Big Ten and being at Penn State. But I think that physically, it seems like he's taking to the strength program. And that's, I think, really one of the first steps when it comes to playing at this level is, being sturdy, being physically able to get through a grind. So he stands out to me. And I think Keith Jones Jr., I think that there was a lot of buzz from him. Noah Pauley talked about him as someone late to football, a basketball player that they really, really liked. A lot of refinement that needs to be done, I think, with him, given how raw he is and whatnot. But I think he's someone that by the time we get to that 15th practice, that we're hearing some really good things about and that everyone is really high on.
Yeah, by my count, there's 3 guys in this receiver room who are 6'4" plus, and Keith Jones Jr., Lyric Samuel, who's still pretty thin, but certainly not as thin as he was last year as a true freshman, and then Brookins, who you just mentioned, and Whitver's a guy that I profiled over at Lions247.com last weekend, leading into spring ball, 3,300 plus receiving yards, one of the most prolific receivers in Virginia high school history. And he's someone who is extremely sharp when it comes to route running. And there's a lot to like about him. I think the one thing you wondered was, would he be a little too thin? Well, he's answering that bell and putting on some really solid weight. And speaking of putting on weight, before I forget to mention it, Matt Campbell threw something interesting our way. 480 pounds collectively added to this Penn State football roster since they got to campus together in January over the course of these last few months. So a lot of good work being done in the weight room and certainly in the dining hall, the cafeteria for Penn State football program. So when you look at the big picture here in terms of what we're going to see, what we're not going to see, and that would probably carry up all the way to the blue-white weekend, and we'll talk about what that might look like a little bit later in this segment. but Rocco Beck will be limited. Those two receivers that we just talked about will be limited. And then Gabe Burkle and Andrew Rappelier, who we expect to be essentially co-starters along with Ben Bramer at tight end. Neither of them will play this spring based on what we understand. So a significant portion of the pass attack for Penn State sidelined or limited this spring, and kind of an incomplete look at that group. And we hope to see them all together in August as they're getting ready for season's kickoff. We heard from Matt Campbell confirm that Anthony Donko will be sidelined. That's something that Mark Brennan from Lions247 was able to report a few weeks ago. The starting right tackle for Penn State to finish last season. We think he's going to be their starting right tackle to open next season. Not going to be available for spring ball. Had some things cleaned up from last year. Going to be good to go in the summer, like essentially all the guys we're talking about. But this led to a broader question that I posed to Matt Campbell. Could he talk us through the offensive line group? Because Donko's the only guy we've actually seen string together some starts for this Penn State squad. Now, we saw Cooper Cousins and Dom Ruley finish the season on the interior in the Pinstripe Bowl with starting roles. But I thought it was interesting to hear what Matt Campbell said regarding Trevor Burr. He said he was one of the top offensive linemen in the Big 12 last year. I know Ryan Clanton from our conversations earlier this offseason, very high on what they're able to bring at the guard position with Trevor Burr. I still think that when you project it out, him and Cooper Cousins are your two primary players on the interior. And then you've got Ruley and the Texas State transfer Brock Riker competing at the center position. But Daniel, just goes to show that when you got Matt Campbell at the podium, he's going to be pretty forthright with things. And he told us 10 guys are in the mix, in their view, to start on the offensive line. And that's probably a pretty similar number to what James Franklin would have gave us this time last year. But unlike last year, most of them have not really started a ton of college games, and almost none of them have started multiple Nittany Lions matchups.
Yeah, when I heard Matt Campbell say that, in my back of my mind, it popped up where I was kind of like, famous last words. We've seen this before, where whether it's, hey, we got a 2 deep at wide receiver, we got 9 starters on the O-line. Easy to say that stuff in the offseason and the preseason, but when push comes to shove, you got to go with the ones who are playing well, and the ones that you trust in that moment. And suddenly those numbers shrink down a lot when it really starts to count. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a good sign, because I do think that you worry a little bit about the trenches when you have big transitions like this. Penn State was already going to have a little bit of an overhaul up front, given what they were losing in terms of the draft and eligibility. But now they were able to replenish it. It's younger guys. I think it's talent that you feel pretty good about. But like you said, it's just we haven't seen much of it on the field. Cooper Cousins, it's been very limited over the course of his career. That Pinstripe Bowl, really the first time it was extended reps. Same thing for Dom Ruley. Pinstripe Bowl, first time it's really been extended reps. And the guys that we're talking about, maybe being potential starters at left tackle, like an Owen Alasine, like a Malachi Goodman, like a Garrett Sexton. It's been basically nothing, from those guys. So you really do have a lot of uncertainty with how that's going to, go through. Trevor Bohr is really intriguing to me. I think that, it's easy to kind of get, caught up with the names who are coming back and maybe some of the names who left. But I think that was a very good addition from Iowa State up front. I do think that, the other guys that they brought over from Ames are all, a little bit on the younger side. 3 redshirt freshmen, followed this staff. Bohr is the only upperclassman from the offensive line who came over. I know they had some guys who lost eligibility and finished their careers at the end of last year. But I think that shows what they think of Trevor Bohr and, what he can be for them.
Something to keep in mind as new offensive line coach Ryan Clayton gets to work with this group on the field is that among all the guys we're discussing, only Dominic Ruley has senior eligibility. Bohr is a junior eligibility, same as Cooper Cousins, same as Anthony Donko. These tackles we're talking about are essentially all freshman and sophomore eligibility. And so not only are you looking to solidify your starting five, or you're too deep here for 2026, but you could really be building toward the future and some continuity in 2027 if you can push the right buttons. And this is a position group that we hope to have some more clarity and feedback for you next episode after we get a look at practice. We won't know the starting five until deep into August, maybe into September. Matt Campbell said this is not going to be something that's settled in March or April, but we can see kind of what the steps are, who's playing where, which side of the line, in what order, and we'll try to bring you that with our practice reports over at Lions247.com starting this Thursday. Tony Rojas, his name did not come up. The starting linebacker for the Nittany Lions has played quite a bit of football going back to 2023 as a freshman, a starter in 24 and 25 before that knee injury last October. But we do expect very little or ultimately no work for Tony Rojas this spring. We talked about that a little bit last episode regarding some storylines, but we'll get a closer look at linebacker. Just kind of wanted to circle back to Rojas to finish out our injury updates here to open spring practice. We got some rave reviews today on a couple of defenders, one of which you already wrote a story on over at Lions247.com. And he's the guy who has more game reps than anyone in a Nittany Lions uniform on this roster. Zion Tracy burned redshirt as a freshman during that run to the Peach Bowl. Played a lot in the Peach Bowl, for better or worse. Got a lot of experience that day against Ole Miss and Jackson Dart, and then continued to grow in his defensive role. Played a ton in the slot for Terry Smith's cornerback unit in the last couple of seasons. And the diversity was brought up and versatility was brought up today in a question to Matt Campbell regarding defenders. And he jumped on it with pointing to Zion Tracy, went above and beyond, called him a chess piece, which is always a fun way to describe any defender. So Danton Lynn and this group has a lot of high expectations, starting with Matt Campbell regarding the senior.
I always think it's funny when coaches refer to players as chess pieces, because I'm always like, well, which one? If he's a pawn, not much you can do there. But I assume that the way that Matt Campbell was talking about Zion Tracy, he sees him a little bit more as a queen, with what he's able to do. It was one of those things where, Matt Campbell got an open-ended question, and I think we're still in that like feeling out stage of, if you give him an open-ended question, how much is he going to give you? Where is he going to take it? And I thought that he took this one in an interesting direction, with Zion Tracy, one of the best football players that maybe I've coached, talked about how he felt like that Zion Tracy shows up in big moments. Part of that is being a punt returner, so catching that ball with everyone bearing down on you. He mentioned the pick 6 against Ohio State. And then, like you said, he talked about how, he could play corner. He could be a good safety. We've seen him do a lot of work at the nickel. And so that really opens things up for you. Tracy is an interesting player because he's one of these guys that has really, I think, kind of quietly played a lot of football, outside of the pick 6 against Ohio State, maybe a little bit more under the radar, especially when you consider the guys who are on the outside, like an AJ Harris, like a Kalen King earlier in his career, those guys getting maybe a lot more attention, taking a little bit of attention away from that nickel spot. But I think, it really speaks to the fact that he held on to that job for two years, shows the trust that Terry Smith had in him, and maybe, where his potential is, where his arrow is pointing. I went back and, looked at, I talked to Zion Tracy for a little bit last month when players were available. He's not the most talkative player, but the one thing that he said that, his future, whether or not he came back to Penn State, it was pretty much tied to Terry Smith. But at the same time, there's also the element where he was like, my family doesn't want to deal with me having to move, halfway across the country, at this point in my college career. He was like, winter break was really the only time that I get away from football. I didn't want to spend that thinking about where I was going to play next, where I was going to go. He was just kind of like, I told Terry to, let me know what he's going to do. And then, that'll pretty much settle it for me. We've talked about it a lot, how, pretty much all those cornerbacks are back. And what that says about Terry Smith and maybe what that says about this defense. And I think Tracy is one of those guys that, in his 4th year, stepping into a leadership role, being recognized like this by his head coach. Maybe what can that mean for his utilization, and what does that mean for this defense?
It's fitting that he was the answer here, because a long time ago, when he was a recruit coming to campus, there was an internal debate on James Franklin's staff about whether he was a better fit at cornerback or receiver. Obviously, he landed on the defensive side of the ball. We've seen him make an impact on the special teams phase of the game as well. Regarding that question of versatility on defense, Matt Campbell also brought up Tony Rojas. He called him a warrior. It's been fun to watch him lead this offseason despite being sidelined by the injury from last year. And so maybe you see Tony Rojas moved across that linebacker unit as the season progresses. He certainly has the skills, the speed, now the size to do that. Caleb Bacon is someone that was also brought up, which isn't surprising because Iowa State was able to really lean on him as an edge rusher. He led them in tackles for loss last year. He was a guy who was really effective as a blitzer. I spoke to some of his counterparts at linebacker who also came from Iowa State, and Cooper Ebel and Caleb Brazina, and both of them mentioned the fact that he has a tremendous bend off the edge, can really contribute to getting after the quarterback, making the opposing passer feel uncomfortable. And so we've been talking about defensive end depth and what can you do from the edge, and do you need help from other spots? And maybe, but also maybe not, because the way that Matt Campbell described Yvan Kamaju and what he saw from the film last year as a true freshman when Kamaju burned red shirt for the Nittany Lions, I mean, this was really impressive, Daniel. I mean, it's one thing after one practice to say we like how this guy's trending, we think he can be a really good player, but what he said about the sophomore was so far beyond that and stuck out to me. I'll have a story up tomorrow on this. And this is a guy that Tyler Calvaruso pointed out as someone that the whole staff was impressed by this offseason with his development. But Campbell said his flashes as a freshman were, quote, nothing short of spectacular, and went on to add his ability is as high as anybody we've coached. So, again, huge roster retention piece. I think because he was a Virginia native, because James Franklin went down to Virginia, a lot of people thought he might be someone who ends up in a Hokies uniform this year. Instead, he's in Happy Valley again for round 2. And along with Max Granville, a redshirt sophomore, a guy that we've spotlighted a few times, coming off an injury. And we also got a little bit of commentary from him from Campbell regarding Granville and what they think he can be. You're starting to see maybe some of that homegrown talent at defensive end can have a disruptive influence, starting with Kamaju, because if he lives up to the billing that Campbell just gave him, he's going to maybe threaten for all Big Ten status as a sophomore.
I think with Kamaju too, I think it was a Penn State Virginia Tech recruiting battle in the first place, because of I think some of his academic pursuits, were really lend itself to Virginia Tech. I mean, the one thing with Kamaju, I know I've said it earlier in this offseason, but like he was Chaz Coleman before Chaz Coleman. When you talk about the buzz that we were hearing, from James Franklin, from the coaching staff, I mean, everyone was really, really high on him coming out of spring ball. Even in January, I think when he got there, we were hearing some good things about the impression that he made, and so it wasn't really a surprise when he ultimately got greenlit down the stretch last year and played a lot of football. I think that that he's one of those guys where getting all that experience under his belt, now having a second full off season in a new weight program with new strength coaches, I think it's really going to lend itself, for him to potentially take a leap forward and be able to do, some different things. And I think that he was really steady last year when he was in. He didn't have those, the same wow plays as Chaz Coleman might have had. But I think, they were able to play Kamaju a ton. I think that's another thing that you go back to is that he was on the field, against those teams that ran the ball. He was also on the field against the teams that passed the ball. I think he's really versatile. I think that he can do some different things for you. And I do think that he's one of those guys that is only going to get better, now that, he is in this program, he's in this structure.
I think some of his most memorable ball, too, was maybe in that Ohio State matchup in Columbus, where I know Chaz Coleman flashed that day, too, but Kamaju did as well. He had 5 tackles for loss on the season, listed now on the roster at 6'3", 254 pounds. And we talked about him being a real well-rounded defensive end last year, not a guy you need to take off the field for obvious passing downs, not a guy you need to take off the field for obvious rushing downs. And he's going to build upon that as a year 2 contributor. And Matt Campbell really piled on the praise today. Let's close out with some thoughts on practice number 15 of spring ball, although just one in the book so far. But that, of course, will be in Beaver Stadium. We've come to call that this blue-white game during my time here covering the team. And under James Franklin, that typically featured scrimmage action, intra-squad scrimmage, split up the group, let them go at each other in front of some crowd, and 4 quarters of running clock usually. Don't touch the quarterback or you get in big trouble. And sometimes it was televised. Often it was televised. Last year, James Franklin made the decision not to have it televised. I think a big part of that and what you're seeing across college football is people don't want their 3rd and 4th stringers getting scouted by other teams who are then going to maybe entice them to jump in the transfer portal and all that stuff, or have intel on some of these young guys. But ultimately, it sounds like we're going to see some action in Beaver Stadium on April 25th, but not quite into detail yet from Matt Campbell. He said the goal is to really interact with the fans, have the fans become a part of this, have the team feel the fans' presence. So many of these guys have never played in Beaver Stadium in front of a crowd. He doesn't want their first time to be in game action come September. And ultimately, they want to get out of this thing healthy. I don't think Matt Campbell mentioned that, but that's going to be imperative too. They're going to want to really get to the finish line with things intact, no long-term injuries popping up that you've got to deal with that linger into preseason camp or possibly beyond. And so, Daniel, what are your thoughts on this event? Because it's really a year-to-year case study. There have been years where it has been a centerpiece of the recruiting calendar. They've used like official visits during the weekend of the blue-white game and really try to make it a spectacle. There's been years where it hasn't been a huge recruiting event. Now, I anticipate Matt Campbell's staff will take advantage of it, especially here in Beaver Stadium, get some recruits around the fans, get some recruits around your team and the staff. But he kept bringing up the connection that he wants to make between his team and the fan base. And this is a new era of Nittany Lions football. I think by the end of the Franklin era and the way it kind of fizzled out, it was a bit of a stale relationship perhaps between many of the fans and the coaching staff and the team's identity. Now you kind of hit the reset button. And I think that's a legitimate point to make from Matt Campbell as we get closer to that date in April 25th. And hopefully we get some details, because I know many of you, if you're going to commit to being at this thing and spending the money on a hotel and spending money on parking and investing the time to drive here, many of you do not live within a close driving distance of State College. You're going to want to know what the heck is the itinerary. And to this point, we just don't know yet.
Yeah, I think the closest Campbell got to specifics was saying, quote, I think you'll get some version of practice. Hopefully we can get some scrimmaging where we get some live reps in practice and be able to showcase that. So we'll see. I mean, it does sound like that there is a little bit of a legitimate numbers crunch when it comes to the number of guys who can't go live. I think we've mentioned, 6 or 7 already, and those are just the ones that we know about. I think we'll have a better idea after getting some looks at practice, where the health of the team is. And I think that's really like the biggest thing. You go back to that 2022 spring game, right before I joined Lions247, where, they didn't have enough linemen. And, they really had to modify things. I think we saw a decent amount of drill work on the field and then, some different sessions that simulated a game. So, maybe it'll be, skewed a little bit more towards that than maybe what we saw last year, from Penn State on the field. But, I do think that Matt Campbell knows what this means, to the community, to getting people in Beaver Stadium in the spring, to see the team, to meet the team, to really generate some excitement. So I don't think you'll necessarily lose all of the blue-white game. I think it'll be a little bit different. But as we saw under James Franklin, it was very different year to year.
Hopefully we have some clarity. We'll get there in 4 weeks from now, and whatever it is, Lions247 will be on hand, and it probably won't be televised. I'd be surprised if it's televised. Maybe I'm wrong, but if it's not televised and you're not in the stadium, you know where to find the play-by-play and the details. We'll bring that to you over at the website. And again, just want to stress something right now, 50% off VIP access. We are on the practice field this week on Thursday, an extended look. And a lot of that information is going to be behind the paywall. So 50% off right now, that deal going at lions247.com, or take a peek, 1 month, full price, but you get Paramount Plus access immediately, so you can stream a bunch of sports and series and movies and stuff like that. Daniel, glad that we're back at it. Look forward to seeing you on the field on Thursday, and then we're going to get to Tyler Calvaruso next, but appreciate your time, man.
Thanks, Tyler.
As promised, this episode of the Lions247 Podcast continues with focus on Penn State recruiting. We got a lot to cover with our guy, Tyler Calvaruso, a couple new crystal ball picks that he put in for anticipated commitments that will ultimately impact Penn State's next recruiting class. And as we said earlier, Penn State football is back on the field. That means prospects are back on campus. We're going to have a lot of recruits coming to town over the next month, taking a close look at how this coaching staff operates with their players through these different practice sessions. And that got underway on Tuesday. So we'll talk about some of the headliners that are coming here to campus on week one, a lot more for our VIP members over at Lions247.com. But without further ado, let's bring in Tyler Calvaruso. Tyler, we got football on the field. We've got recruits in Happy Valley. We got plenty to discuss for the next several weeks.
It's a great time, man. I'm excited. I know you're excited. So it's a good time to be doing this. Back in action. We got recruits back on campus for the first time in a couple of months. We're going to have a lot to get into over this next, month plus?
Absolutely. And something that you kind of brought to the forefront on Monday on spring practice eve, as you called it, was a couple of crystal ball predictions. And we went over this a couple of weeks ago when you last did it, but talk us through once again what goes into these predictions. These are ultimately forecasting a prospect to end up joining Penn State's recruiting class. Talk about what leads you to make these kind of decisions and why you felt like this was the right time before we discuss these two particular names.
You're going to get both of these guys back on campus during spring ball, so that's a starting point. We've talked pretty often about these spring practice visits carrying the utmost importance for this staff. They want guys to come to campus and watch them coach and go through the team meetings and all that kind of stuff. Get a really good look at what it would be like to play at Penn State for this new regime. So that went into the decision-making process on a crystal ball pick on these two. And then it's all the other usual stuff. You got, for me, hear from multiple sources that are in the know in their recruitment, don't like to go off just one, and make sure that we're checking all of the boxes that need to be checked before a pick goes in. Because a lot does go into it. You don't just throw it at the wall and hope it sticks. I think that does a disservice to everyone who reads the crystal ball article and looks at the prediction. And like I said, when we talked about the last time, you don't want to instill false hope or come across a certain way when you're doing these predictions. You want to make sure that you're on the ball, whether it be a prediction for Penn State or a prediction going against Penn State. Because, Cole Reeder is a guy who visited last week before the beginning of spring practice. I think the visit went well. But, for example, I'm probably going to put a pick in for Wisconsin. I think that's where he's going to land. So no matter whether it's for Penn State or against Penn State, make sure it's as thoroughly done as possible, as detail-oriented as possible, and make sure we're covered in every way possible before we put that pick in, because it matters to me. I know it matters to you, and I'd like to think our readers appreciate the thoroughness that goes into the process. But either way, we've got two new picks in.
We always appreciate your thoroughness. We always appreciate your transparency, TC. And let's dive into it right now. Earlier today on Tuesday, Cooper Alexander made his Penn State practice debut. He's a new tight end on this squad. He's one of the three tight ends they brought over from Iowa State. He's got a few years of eligibility ahead of him, unlike the other two who are seniors. So he could be a key part of the future here in the tight end room for the Nittany Lions. Maybe his brother could be a key part of the future on the defensive side of the football. He is one of those two crystal ball picks you've got in from Washington High School in Oklahoma, linebacker Case Alexander. You look at the composite rankings from the industry, number 219 overall nationally, the number 20 linebacker in the class of 2027. And not only is his brother a big-time college football player, a guy who has a chance to make some noise here at the Power Conference level, he is the son of former Oklahoma tight end Steven Alexander, who was a second-round draft pick back in 1998, spent 10 years in the NFL with a variety of teams. So he's got some lineage going on in Norman with the Sooners. He certainly has a family tie now here in State College. I'd imagine because of his brother, there's already a lot of familiarity in place with Taylor Mauser, the offensive coordinator and tight ends coach here for the Nittany Lions now. So talk us through where things stand with Case Alexander and why you see this trending towards him ultimately reuniting with his big brother.
Yeah, it's not often we talk about an Oklahoma kid who's an Oklahoma legacy. We don't talk about that in Penn State recruiting circles all that often, but we're talking about it here with Case Alexander, composite four-star linebacker, really talented kid, one of those top names on the linebacker board for this staff. That was the case when this group was at Iowa State. It has remained the case at Penn State. Alexander, the big thing, so he visited in January. He already knew Matt Campbell and the rest of the crew pretty well, but had to get to know Tyson Vite a little bit more. He wasn't part of that Matt Campbell staff at Iowa State. So that was a new figure, new face, new presence in his recruitment. And it checked out really well during his junior day visit by all accounts. And Penn State set the bar pretty high during that visit, and they positioned themselves as tough to beat in Alexander's recruitment. Oklahoma recently got him back to campus, and the Sooners continue to come up in conversation, which doesn't strike me as shocking, surprise, anything like that, because look, the legacy factor, it's a local option, go play in the SEC. There's definitely an attraction there, but you've got Cooper Alexander here at Penn State. Those two are really close. The feedback has been pretty positive early on for what's going on in State College to Alexander back in Oklahoma. So there's just a lot going for Penn State in this recruitment. Alexander hasn't confirmed a date yet, but he's expected back on campus at some point during spring practice. And look, maybe it's the blue-white games. He gets to see his brother on the field, but whether it's earlier than that, it doesn't really matter. As long as he gets back to campus, this one's shaping up really well.
Case Alexander, right around 90 tackles average through his first three high school seasons. So he's approaching 300 career tackles before his senior season next fall. Additionally, though, I couldn't help but notice what he accomplished on offense last year. He was over 16, 17 yards per catch as a tight end. 12 touchdowns. He ran for a couple touchdowns as well. I think he was playing tight end. Maybe he was playing receiver, because certainly not the same physical stature as his older brother Cooper, who is playing tight end at the college level. We've got him at 6'2", right around 200 pounds. Has there been any interest from him playing offense at the college level? What might that positional outlook be? And is it just simply all linebacker in his recruitment? Because he has been extremely productive on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, it's been all linebacker. I haven't heard anything about offense from any program. It's been all linebacker for Case Alexander. That's where these schools feel he projects best at the next level.
Makes sense to me. And when you look at his film and you look at kind of what he brings to the field at this stage of his career, and we talked about the connections, we talked about his recruitment. Let's talk about the prospect himself. What do you like about Case Alexander's body of work and kind of his prospect profile with another year of high school ball ahead of him?
Athletic kid, he's going to continue to get stronger. He's already pretty strong. Just kind of fits the profile of what Penn State looks for at linebacker. If you go back and look at some of the bodies that Matt Campbell and his staff brought in at Iowa State. And again, it's a different group. It's not the same exact group. You've got the Anton Lynn in place as DC. You've got, as I mentioned, Tyson Vite at linebackers coach, and Dan Connors very involved in that room as well. So it's the same look, but it's a different look as well, but it still fits the mold of what Penn State wants at the position. He can get downhill, make plays in the backfield, athletic enough to move laterally, play in coverage, can make plays sideline to sideline for you. Like I said, going to continue getting stronger, going to continue to improve that athletic profile. So trending in the right direction as a player developmentally, still a lot of room for growth physically and skill set wise. So that's where I believe the intrigue really centers, just what lies ahead for Case Alexander. Already a really good player, but there's a lot more ahead of him. And Penn State wants to be able to tap into that.
Well, crystal ball number one for Case Alexander, linebacker from Oklahoma, a little brother of a current Nittany Lion. Let's go from Oklahoma to Ohio, where we find defensive back Keshan Telfair. And this is also four-star territory. In fact, we're going to climb up the ladder in rankings a little bit, going from Alexander to Telfair. Number 113 overall in our top 24/7 rankings. He's the number 14 cornerback, the number 4 player in the state of Ohio, and a really robust offer sheet that's over 40. Plenty of college football playoff contenders have put scholarships on the table. So this strikes me as a significant crystal ball pick, because what are the kind of connections that are in place to give you this confidence? He seems like the kind of guy who could certainly string things out, go on 5-6 different official visits, really kind of have a chance to get a scope of the entire national recruiting scene. And yet here we are, late March, and you say, I like Penn State.
It's Terry Smith, and this is one of those recruitments where there's a kind of the only 2 words you have to say, because Terry Smith has been recruiting this kid really hard for an extended period of time. Goes back to last fall, possibly even earlier. They've gotten Telfair on campus. He's going to be back on campus for a spring practice visit in the middle of April. Again, Terry Smith has done a really good job keeping Penn State high on the list through the coaching change, because Telfair probably had Penn State on top before the coaching change. When Campbell came over from Iowa State, you just don't know. But Smith has done a really good job, and he's excited to get back out to State College, meet the rest of this new staff. We're talking about a blue chip talent at corner. We're in that blue chip range when it comes to who Telfair is as a player and what he can develop into at the next level. You've got Clemson in the mix. You've got Miami in the mix. You've got Notre Dame in the mix a little bit more. I'm kind of interested to see where things go with the Fighting Irish in terms of how hard they push, because they've got a pretty deep board in the secondary. Telfair's on it, but there are a lot of players who kind of fall in that similar ranking range and similar caliber of player. And you look, Miami's board is a little bit similar. Clemson's board is a little bit similar, but he's a very clear priority for those two programs. He's got official visits locked in with those two, in addition to Penn State. Back at Penn State for an official visit in June. I had someone ask me recently if I thought Telfair was going to commit before those officials. Asking around, not quite sure if that's going to play out. It seems like he's very much inclined to go through the full gauntlet of spring visits, whether it be unofficial or official, before coming to a decision. But, we've seen plenty of instances where these guys from out of the region, in-state guys as well, they pop up and they have really good relationships with Terry Smith, and they make it out to campus, and that's kind of enough for them to feel comfortable and feel good about committing to Penn State. I don't know if that's going to happen with Telfair when he visits in April, but I'm not ruling it out, because again, that relationship's a driving force. Telfair very, very high on Penn State. It's kind of like Alexander, where we have conversations in recruiting, and not often do we discuss Penn State going to Ohio and being in this strong with one of the state's top recruits. I think in the back of your mind, you always kind of say, hey, look, let's see what Ohio State does in this recruitment. And I do think there's still an element of that. But as things stand right now, Penn State has built up a ton of positive momentum to the point where even if Ohio State does try and jump more and more into the mix, it could be a Chaz Coleman type situation where you say, hey, look, we've already got so much goodwill built up here. The relationships already are where they need to be. Let's go with Penn State. Let's go with what we're seeing there. So we'll see when Telfair visits in April. But heading into spring ball, I like the Nittany Lions on top in his recruitment.
Telfair resides in the southern shore of Lake Erie, and tell me a little bit about what kind of tone that might set. If you get a guy like Alexander and Telfair, and they were to commit to this class in the relatively near future as early building blocks. Remember, the 2027 recruiting class, as currently standing, does not feature a commitment. I think a few weeks ago, we may have discussed how things were trending in a pretty promising direction, perhaps with Peter Bork, one of the top quarterback recruits in the country. We had talked about what it would mean to get him on board early and kind of be a flag bearer for this class, someone that could be a bit of a Pied Piper perhaps in drawing more prospects to campus. What would it mean, in your opinion, if Telfair and Alexander jumped on board sooner rather than later in setting the tone for the defensive side of things?
It would definitely help, because I think, generally speaking, they want to lock some guys down sooner rather than later. But I think if you look at the way this staff operated at Iowa State from a calendar perspective on when things really start to heat up with their recruiting classes, they're not putting the screws to these guys right now. They're letting them go do their thing on the trail, go through the process, and when they're ready to hop on board, they're ready to hop on board. So that's why I think as spring practice progresses, you're going to see, I think, some momentum start to build up in Penn State's favor, and I think it's very realistic to assume that could come in the form of commitments. That's why I'm not ruling either of these guys out for spring ball. I think if I had to pick between the two of who was going to make the leap during the spring, or specifically March and April, because official visit season is still the spring as well in June. It's not summer quite yet. That's something that I got to keep catching myself on in these articles. But
June is summer. I don't care what the calendar says. June is summer. It's fine.
Nah, that's how I'm viewing it. But hey, look, we got to be, like I said, man, detail oriented. But I think I'd lean Alexander. If someone's going to make a move during spring ball, I think I'd lean Alexander, just given the relationships, the long-standing relationships already in play. I know Telfair has his long-standing relationship with Terry Smith, but it's a little bit different of a recruitment when you look at the other programs involved and at least what has been relayed to me when it comes to visit plans on going through the entirety of the slate. I haven't heard the same kind of thing with Alexander. His recruitment in general is a little bit quieter. It's kind of tougher to dig some stuff up there. So he could go through the entirety of his slate, and we just don't know it yet. But again, those relationships, the trust in Matt Campbell, I think of the two, I'd lean more towards Case Alexander if someone's going to make a move in March or April.
Good stuff, Tyler. And by the time we sat down and talked about this, you've already got recruits with feet on campus. We haven't really talked about that aspect of what's happening for Penn State recruiting since January, when they hosted some of those junior days early on with the staff getting acclimated. Now they're on the football field. You've talked about it for a long time, about the opportunity that they saw to have prospects seeing how they work in live action. We're through one day of that. There's more practices to come this week. We're going to get on the field for one of those on Thursday. So we'll be sharing the sideline with some of these recruits. Give us just a few names. You can find a lot more over at Lions247 if you're a VIP member. If you're not, hop on board right now. 50% off an annual subscription will take you all the way into next March. Or you can take 1 month at a time and you get automatic Paramount Plus access. So a couple options for you to hop in at the right time right now. But Tyler, bring a few names to the podcast that you're particularly intrigued by as they made their way to campus or will make their way to campus to see some Penn State practice action.
Yeah, day one, pretty solid group. Some under-the-radar guys on that list. I want to start with London Hampton out of the Midwest, one of those sleeper athlete types in that region. He is, I'd say, probably going to be a linebacker or a safety at the next level. I think that's how the majority of schools, Penn State included, are recruiting him. He's got some pretty good wide receiver ability, but if you go turn on the film and you watch what he's accomplished on that defensive side of the ball, really, really good player, a lot of upside. Michigan State setting the tone in that recruitment right now, but Penn State's more and more in the mix as of late. Interested to see where things go if Penn State can make this one interesting, but Hampton's an intriguing one from day one. In state, you've got a bunch of Western Pennsylvania kids who made it out. John Sasek, the offensive lineman from Central Catholic in Pittsburgh. Penn State hasn't offered there, but they've been charting him. I'm waiting to see if Zachary Gleason made it to campus. When I checked in with him earlier this week, it seemed like he might move that visit back. Still have him on the list for now, but there's a chance that he didn't make it on Tuesday. So we'll see. We'll circle back on that one. But that's a guy if Penn State pushes, they're in a pretty good spot to have Gleason in that class at cornerback if things come together in that manner. So whether or not he visited on Tuesday, we'll have some clarity over at Lions247 when that clarity is available to me. But in the meantime, Gleason, keep an eye on him whether he visited today or not. Moving forward beyond that group in 28, very interesting group of 28 visitors from the Western PA area. Brandon Murphy from Clareton and Nick Anderson, offensive lineman at Kiski area. Oh man, I love this kid's tape. Really, really good player. Really good player. He's a Penn State legacy. His dad played for the Nittany Lions in the mid-90s. I think he's going to continue to rack up some offers sooner rather than later. Don't know if Penn State's going to be one quite yet. Would not surprise me if the Nittany Lions ultimately make their move because, again, this kid could play. He's a straight-up player. And tough, physical, moves really, really well for a 2028 recruit. A lot to like on that front. Really a lot to like. And beyond, they've got Justice Hardy. This is a kid we need to talk about a little bit more. Running back from Central PA. He's out in Reading. Just transferred to Wilson High after playing his junior year at Wyomissing. And Penn State hasn't offered. They've been keeping an eye on him for a little while now. 10-8 in the 100-meter. I mean, the kid's a burner. He's got a couple ACC official visits locked in right now. He's got Duke. He's got North Carolina. So we'll see where this one goes as Savon Huggins fills out his running backs board. It's continuing to come together. I mean, we just saw some new offers go out. Shu Odo from New Jersey. He's got an official visit on his schedule now. So that running backs board is still coming together. So that's day one. That's the way it's looking. There's some other guys, like you said, I'm not going to get into every single one of them because we've got to keep some juice on the site. But throughout this week, on Thursday, when we're going to be out there on practice, we got guys like Khalil Taylor making the trip, or at least expected to make the trip. I mean, I don't think I need to get into the importance of Khalil Taylor in this 26 class for Penn State. We talk about that ad nauseum with him. Such an important recruit for Penn State I said 26, 27. So they want to bring him in, and it's important that he's getting back to campus early in the spring practice visit. So he's got an official visit locked in for June. So Penn State's going to continue to keep the ball rolling in the right direction with Khalil Taylor. Then this weekend, and also on Thursday, Jaden Jones from Avonworth High in the Pittsburgh area, another Western PA kid. I really like him. He's a 28, doesn't have an offer yet, but I could see that changing very, very soon. His tape is really good. He doesn't have a ranking on our end yet, but when that comes, I think it'll be a pretty highly rated prospect that we're talking about here with Jaden Jones. And this weekend's the big group coming in on the 28th, Saturday. We got 27s, 28s, really talented group coming. We got Deontay Flemings coming back to campus in 28. First time on campus since he committed to Penn State during his junior day visit in January. Then in 27, just to run through a few, I'd say the top names, you got Isaiah Alvarez, wide receiver from Don Bosco, New Jersey. He's going to be on campus. He already has an official visit scheduled. Mason Holloman, an offensive lineman from Illinois, really important target for Ryan Clanton. He's going to be on campus. Brandon Lockley, Philly area linebacker we've talked about a bunch recently. Penn State has ground to make up there. He's going to be back on campus. Then Zamar Tukes, defensive lineman out of New York State in the Rochester area. Really good player. High on the board for Akaika Malloy. Penn State really likes him. They're going to get him back to town. And he also has an official visit scheduled. So, again, there are others. There are plenty of others. We've got the full expected group over at Lions247. But it's going to be a busy week. It's a good week for Penn State. I think this is a nice way to get things rolling on the visitor front in spring ball. And we're going to see plenty more of this throughout the spring. Many top targets are locked in, and this is just the start of it.
In classic Calvaruso, I ask for a few names. We get a scroll of names, and that's okay. Our audience appreciates it. And as you said, that's just kind of a peek onto that list and what that's looking like. And those lists will continue to grow as we get more confirmations. That's kind of a subplot here as we see this new Penn State football team progressing on the spring practice circuit in the next few weeks. You're also going to be generating a lot of interest and intrigue on the recruiting trail and kind of understanding a little bit about who's kind of a viable option, who's trending in certain directions with the Nittany Lions staff. And it's going to be fun to follow with you, Tyler Calvaruso. I know Brian Doan will be chiming in as well. Our national recruiting analyst going to be helping out with coverage as he always does. But good stuff from you, breaking it down here on the podcast. You're going to come to campus with us. You're going to be on the sideline as well Thursday with some of these recruits. Remember, we're not allowed to interview them during practice, so keep your microphone away. You'll have to wait till afterwards. But it'll be fun to get you back here on campus. We're going to have the whole team, the whole Lions 24/7 coverage crew on the field Thursday for our first look at Nittany Lions practice since back in December. And you may have heard things have changed quite a bit for the Nittany Lions roster and coaching staff since Pinstripe Bowl prep. So we're going to bring a ton, and I mean a ton, of fresh content to you at Lions247.com later this week into the weekend. We're going to have interviews. We're going to have video highlights. We're going to have photo galleries. We're going to have practice notebooks, a lot of good stuff as the floodgates are really going to open here regarding this 2026 Penn State football program. Big thanks to Daniel Gallen for joining me fresh out of Matt Campbell's press conference. And big thanks to you, Tyler, for hopping on and talking some recruiting. On behalf of those guys and our entire team, I am Tyler Donahue, and this has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.